So welcome, everybody. I am Tricia Altman. I'm the Director of Programs and Engagement here at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. We were founded in 1814, and we are a member-supported library. We are a circulating library, an archives, and a community forum. So if you're not already a member, but you like books, you like languages, you like history, you like the arts, if you're looking for a nice place to work, consider becoming a member. We'd love to have you. So it is my pleasure to introduce our program this evening. 83 years ago today, on February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal of all persons deemed a threat to national security from their homes along the West Coast to the so-called relocation centers. The order resulted in the incarceration of approximately 122,000 Japanese Americans in camps located in 10 remote sites across 7 states. Tonight we'll have a film screening and discussion to remember these events. We are screening the NFL Films documentary, Fear, Football, and Theft of Freedom, which traces the family history of former NFL linebacker Scott Fujita to the Japanese American incarceration camps during World War II. The film also tells the amazing story of the high school football team, the Eagles, go Birds, of the Heart Mountain Camp in Wyoming. It is based on our guest Bradford Pearson's 2021 book entitled The Eagles of Heart Mountain, A True Story of Football, Incarceration, and Resistance in World War II America. Brad is a Philadelphia-based National Magazine Award-winning journalist and author whose work has been featured in the New York Times, Esquire, and Time, among other publications. He is currently the editor-in-chief of Philadelphia Magazine and a contributing writer for the New York Times Special Projects team. Brad will be in conversation with Dr. Beth Hessel, Executive Director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia since 2019. In addition to being our fearless leader, Beth is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament who holds a PhD in U.S. history. Her dissertation was entitled Let the Conscience of Christian America Speak, Religion and Empire in the Incarceration of Japanese Americans, 1941 to 45. So I just want to give a heads up. Our program, the schedule for our program this evening is going to be the following. So the documentary is approximately 22 minutes in length, and then Brad and Beth will have a talk for about 30 minutes or so. There's going to be about 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience, and then Brad is going to close with a short reading from his book, and so that should take us to about 7:15 or so. And with that, I'm honored to introduce Brad, who's going to set us up for the film.
Thanks to everyone for coming tonight. The Athenaeum is a really important place for me because I actually wrote a lot of the book here. So for me, always coming back to the Athenaeum, even though, I only live a few blocks away, is nice, and especially with a crowd like this to talk about a subject that's really near and dear to my heart and has been since I started working on this book over a decade ago. This book came out in 2021, and it's always exciting, even 4 years later, to still have new audiences to talk about this subject with. And last year, when the National Football League reached out to me and said they wanted to do a documentary based partly on my book, I thought, well, there's an audience that I didn't fully expect to be able to talk to. And it was a really great experience for me to help them work on this documentary. And I think even though I was there on set while they were shooting it, I was still sort of surprised by how well I think it turned out. So I hope everybody enjoys it, and we'll talk soon right afterwards.
Over the middle, intercepted. Scott Fujita, his first National Football League interception.
My name is Scott Fujita. I'm a father, a husband, and a Super Bowl champion. I played 11 years in the National Football League.
Picked off by Scott Fujita.
But despite my on-field success, the number one thing I was asked about was the name on the back of my jersey.
Scott Fujita might just have saved the Saints' season.
But to understand my name and my story, you must understand the pain and the sacrifices that name has endured.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
We had just come home from church, kind of numb, trying to absorb the news.
I was about a mile away from home visiting some friends who were all white. And one of them happened to say, hey, we're at war with you guys.
Our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger.
I go to Japanese school right after American school. A few days later, someone burnt that Japanese school down.
It was pretty dangerous. My dad was walking home from school one day, and this kid said, hey, Jap kid, I'm gonna shoot you. Came out with a .22 rifle and shot him in the back. His mom got a butter knife, took the bullet out of his back.
With the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
The War Department convinced Roosevelt that all Japanese need to be removed from the West Coast, and that becomes the genesis of the infamous Executive Order 9066.
Oh my gosh. That photo had to have been when we first got you home. My wife and I weren't able to have children, but we wanted children, so the alternative was to adopt.
I always felt lucky and proud to be adopted. I recognized the fact that I didn't look like my dad, particularly as I aged and grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. But again, that was just part of my story and part of what I think made me unique.
I remember one time we were at a Japanese friend's house, and his grandsons were there, and Scott goes outside and he says, hi, my name's Scott Fujita, I'm Japanese. And these little Japanese boys are looking at him like, what? They didn't quite know what to make of that.
Growing up, I heard references to life in camp. I think I knew that my dad was born in a camp, but it wasn't something he talked a whole lot about. It wasn't something that my grandparents even talked a whole lot about until I aged and learned a little bit more about this experience. My grandfather, Nagao, he was a student at the University of California, Berkeley. My grandmother, Lily, she worked at Cal. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, news began to surface that there would be a forced relocation. My grandparents chose to get married at that time to ensure that they wouldn't be split up.
Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens. Some among them were potentially dangerous. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
The next thing that happened was that a Caucasian man walked into our farm, offered a price for the entire farm, car, truck, horses, crops, everything. Take it or leave it. You don't take it, you get nothing.
I just assumed that whatever was happening was correct, because I didn't think the United States government would do anything wrong.
And then we were loaded on a train.
Some old train, 3 days and 4 nights.
With all the shades drawn.
We sneak a view through the blinds and watching for signs, what towns we were going through.
I remember what a miserable trip that was.
And I remember getting put on a truck, and then the truck took us to wherever our particular home was going to be for the next 3 years.
When we arrived at Hart Mountain.
Barbed wire fence, armed guard towers.
Not good.
Some people said it was to protect us from the general public because we had the face of the enemy. But one of the curious observations was that the guns are pointed in to the camp, not out.
Hart Mountain was built rapidly on a piece of land that apparently nobody wanted.
The buildings were very rickety. The walls had gaps in it. And you could even feel the breeze coming in.
The room was a square room, and half the room was just taken up by the bed. So one of the conditions right away was it was crowded.
The toilets were all community. There were 10 toilets, 10 wash basins, and 2 shower rooms.
For just over 10,000 people. And so you want to take a shower, you had to take a shower with a whole bunch of other people, but that's the way it was.
To learn more about our history, my father and I traveled to the Hart Mountain Relocation Center in northwestern Wyoming.
There's nothing here now, but this is the view of where the entire camp was before. 10,000 people, the third largest city in Wyoming at the time. Wow. All gone now, but that's the view that would have been filled with barracks.
And I guess this gives you sort of a real life feel for what life may have been like here. I mean, here we are in May, and, you know, wind gusts around 60 miles per hour, you know, temperatures in the high 40s.
The Hart Mountain Camp, located in Wyoming, of the 10 big long-term camps run by the War Relocation Authority, was the furthest north and at the highest altitude, and I think it pretty clearly had the worst conditions.
It was the coldest the winters I recall was in 42. It was a son of a bitch. They were never ready for this weather and the bitterness of it. It was a case of war hysteria, racism. They didn't take up arms. They weren't figuring out how to burn the camp. They endured. They were Americans.
Even surrounded by prejudice and hate, something pure and hopeful was born.
There started being rumblings about how it might be beneficial to start a football team. When they had the first practice, 40 guys showed up, and only 3 had ever played high school football before.
When I went out for football, he found me a pair of pants that was 2 times bigger than myself. Seemed like I'm swimming in that pants. We had to take whatever they gave us.
The players would have to just shove cardboard down to cover their thighs and tape it up with athletic tape.
They played on solid, hard dirt. He said after the games, they're always gashed up.
There was literally nothing beyond 100 yards, 2 end zones, a couple goalposts. Hopefully you guys can make a game of this.
And this was one of the most unique situations of the history of high school football in Wyoming, was a team that could only play at home because they were essentially prisoners.
So the first game the Eagles ever play is against a team from Warland, which is also in North Wyoming. And this was a team that was really well known. And the fact that the Eagles even got this team on their schedule was sort of a miracle in and of itself.
Warland was a really consistent competitor. They won like 4 championships in a row in the mid-20s.
This team comes into Hart Mountain through the barbed wire and past the military police, and they show up at this dirt field, and it's lined with more than 4,000 people from the camp.
I'm standing there by myself. I'm like a 13-year-old kid. I did not get to see hardly anything because too many people. The crowd was so much.
Just about the whole camp came out to watch. And we obviously rooted for our own teams, and we thought our guys were pretty darn good, considering sort of a thrown together team.
Well, the first game for the Eagles, all I remember is carrying the ball about 3-4 times.
A really just knockdown, drag-out game.
3 yards and a cloud of snow. There wasn't much creativity.
Very late in the game, the Eagles score a touchdown and Moreland fumble the kickoff, and the Eagles win their first game.
It gave everybody in the camp a sense of pride, living in these camp conditions, and that were able to be put together and participate and play the so-called all-American game called football and be very competitive against the outside schools.
These are yearbooks. The 1944 tempo, and here's where you can see some of the football players in the high school yearbook. So here it's talking about the Eagles as a thundering herd. They signed their photos, like Keiichi Ikeda signed his football photo there. I don't know, how's their form?
Their head coach was a man by the name of Ray Thompson, but he had an assistant coach whose name was Tubby Kawasaki, who was from the West Coast and had played junior college football. They started experimenting with what has become known now as a spread offense. So Tubby brought those skills and things that he had learned playing college football and really tried to apply them to high school football, which hadn't been done at that point and definitely hadn't been done in Wyoming.
I was left halfback, all of 125 pounds, I guess. Playing against the Caucasians, they could be up to 200 pounds, some of them.
All these young men took this disadvantage of being smaller and really turned it on its head. You have to come up with end arounds. You have to throw the ball a little bit more often because you're not going to run the ball and get it past a 200-pound guy from Lovell or Red Lodge, Montana. So defenses had no idea how to defend it. The Eagles got past the line of scrimmage. Essentially, they were gone. The Eagles finished their first season 3-0, undefeated. They had tried to book more games, but they had a hard time scheduling games because I don't think anyone really wanted to send their students into this camp to lose to this team.
So the second season, they ended up playing the same 3 teams that they played the first season, which was Lovell, Worland, and then Red Lodge, Montana. And then here comes Natrona.
Natrona was one of the big, powerful high schools, and still remains so today in Wyoming, and especially in Wyoming football.
Natrona was left with this hole on its schedule, and they went looking for a team to play with like 2 weeks' notice. Natrona's coach and the folks at Heart Mountain were able to touch base, and Natrona, to their credit, said, hey, great team, great opportunity, let's go make this happen.
Natrona not only brought their team with them, but they brought one player whose name was Leroy Pierce. Leroy Pierce is by far the best player that Heart Mountain has ever played against. And they immediately fall into a really quick hole, down 13-0 really quickly in the game. And this was the first time not only that they had trailed in a game, but the first time they'd ever been scored against. So they had to decide, are we just gonna sort of turn over here, or are we gonna really fight to try to find our way back into this game? And as they've done all the years in camp, whether it was on the football field or outside of the football field, they fought back. And it's 19-13. They have one last shot at the end zone, and a guy by the name of Georgia Hero unfortunately drops the game-winning touchdown. You could look at this as a loss, and the only loss that the Eagles ever played. But from my perspective, it's this really clarifying and solidifying moment where the Eagles proved to not only everybody in the camp, not only to themselves, but to everybody in the state of Wyoming, that they were a team that wasn't a figment. They weren't just something that happened in this camp that people could forget about when the camp closed. They were a real football team.
The fact that they played against the best and were right there hanging with the best teams in the state, I think in that loss, it really legitimized how good of a team they were to a lot of people.
The Eagles would never play another game. Earlier that year, the U.S. government instituted the draft for Japanese Americans inside of the camps. Some, understandably, resisted their service, including 63 here at Heart Mountain. But the majority of those called upon faithfully served their country, and some, like my grandfather, even volunteered to serve. I'd seen some of the memorabilia, and I've seen my grandfather's medals, and I've seen, his uniform and his chest and his typewriter, all of which said 442nd RCT, Regimental Combat Team, on them. So I knew that he was, a veteran of World War II. I knew that he was, in my eyes, a hero. And then what I didn't know or properly understand or appreciate was that he fought for the 442nd, which ended up being one of the most decorated battalions through the entirety of World War II. Also that it was made up of entirely Japanese Americans.
He wanted to prove that he was an American, so that's why he was willing to go fight for his country.
Here's someone who is making the decision to go and fight for and defend the country, who is currently imprisoning one's family. The juxtaposition of that I find fascinating and just really, really powerful. So much has changed since the end of World War II. But the shadow of fear and bigotry lingers.
After 9/11, there was this incredible wave of racism and prejudice against Muslim Americans, but not only just Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, Sikhs, lots of different people that sort of got wrapped up in this fervor after September 11th. And that really just mirrors a lot of the sort of prejudice and lies that came after Pearl Harbor.
It instantly popped into my head, the camps, when the situation was going on after 9/11. I thought, oh my, this is starting all over again. It was scary.
So many people saying we got to round up all the Muslims, throw them in the concentration camps, and then ship them out of the country. And then I thought back to our experience. We don't want that to happen ever again in America.
Probably the most famous person who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain was a young man named Norman Mineta. And he becomes a transportation secretary under George W. Bush. After September 11th, Mineta is adamant that the airlines across the United States do not profile folks coming in and out of the United States on airplanes due to their race or their religion. Norm, knowing that he had been incarcerated simply because of his background, was now the person who was in charge of and was telling airlines to not fall into that same trap that the federal government fell into in 1941 and 1942. And he serves as this really powerful example of someone whose lived life experience really came to color his professional experience decades and decades later.
We close out our exhibit by talking about the post-war years even further, including the movement for redress and the apology. I saw your apology letter signed by George H.W. Bush.
Yes, I received a letter and some sort of financial, I guess you'd say, compensation or something. The sad thing is, though, that a year before this happened, my father had passed away. So, he didn't get any of that.
People want to look at the United States, I think, a lot of times as the hero of World War II. And that's true in a lot of ways. It's true for a lot of people. But to sort of turn a blind eye to the atrocities that the United States was committing here on its own soil, I think just takes away from the legacy in general.
We have to talk about it. And the wrongs that happen, if we don't talk about it, it will happen again.
I think it's taking the message from my grandma Lily to me many years ago, and it's recognizing the fact that, hey, this is an important story to tell. We went through a really, really hard time together, and guess what? Perhaps we became stronger for it, and what's next? This is painful history to revisit. So many people, like my father, struggle to share the weight of these memories. But standing on that hill, overlooking the land that held thousands of citizens like my grandparents prisoner, I couldn't help but think back at the lives that were changed, the strength that was shown, and the lessons we have yet to fully understand. We have to learn from the mistakes that were made, and we owe it to every man, woman, and child who is held there to make sure their stories live on forever.
All right, I don't usually get to sit up here, so you're all down low. It's good to see you all tonight. Thank you for coming to this program on an important evening, a cold evening, so we're glad you're all here. Brad, I'm so glad you're here.
Me too.
I enjoyed getting to know Brad as he was working on his book. We did a virtual program when your book came out because we were in the middle of the pandemic.
My book came out on January 5th, 2021, the day before January 6th. So it was a busy week. Yeah.
Yes. So it's been a little while, and about a year ago you shared with us about the NFL documentary that was being made, and we thought this would be a great opportunity. I thought maybe documentary meant it would be an hour long or something, and so this is great. It's 22 minutes, which gives us a chance to dive back in with you, because not everybody here has read your book or heard you talk about the topic, so really glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So my first question I want to ask you, why on February 19th, the date that EO 9066 was signed, should we be watching a documentary and talking about a football team in an incarceration camp?
Well, I think, this date for a lot of Japanese Americans is a really terrible date, that their families' lives and their trajectories and their histories were changed forever. And I think that thinking about this day and having a moment to sort of take a beat and think about what that meant for those, not only those 125,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, but for their families and their families' legacies and the families that continue to sort of share that family burden and that legacy that they've had, for the past 83 years. And I think that, 9066 was, in a way that a lot of executive orders was sort of this sweeping idea that didn't necessarily it didn't mention the word Japanese once in it. It was so broadly written that it could be applied to pretty much anyone in the United States, purposefully so that it couldn't be specifically called out in the courts as being targeted at Japanese Americans. And just sort of, I always think about 9066 in a way that I think it was unnecessary for lots and lots of reasons, obviously. But I also think that if you look at how it was applied only to the West Coast of the United States. And it wasn't only just applied to, not the West Coast, but like if you lived in Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon, you didn't even have to go to the camps. So if you lived just over this arbitrary boundary that the United States government had set up, but were also Japanese American, you were not considered, quote, dangerous in the eyes of the federal government. But if you lived 2 miles west, you were, and then had to go to the camp, even if you were 6 months old.
Which I guess is a great answer when someone says, oh, well, Japanese Americans were all a danger, they had to be put in, the story of, 6-month-old orphans who were put into, a camp because they are potentially fifth column.
Right, yeah, when I was researching
saboteurs.
the book, I spent a lot of time in the archives at Hart Mountain and then the National Archives, and a lot of that stuff, when the camps closed, they just sort of arbitrarily grabbed lots of documents, shoved them into folders, and then put them all on microfilm. So a lot of the research was going through lots and lots of microfilm that I didn't need for the book. And one of them, I found this card that was essentially a roster of people that had been incarcerated from this one section of Los Angeles. And every age was less than 10 years old. And some of them were in months. And it was because it was a Catholic orphanage that was dedicated to Japanese American children who had been orphaned. And the fact that the federal government thought, we have to go in and take not only Japanese American children, but Japanese American orphans who, due to the fact that they're orphans, have very little connection to the Japanese community at all, and consider them a threat was a really clarifying moment when I was writing the book, thinking about what the actual stakes are for the book and what the government did to its own citizens.
So tell me how you got into this topic. What sparked your interest in the Eagles and in this topic? What did you know about Japanese American incarceration history before you started researching? And tell us a little bit about that process for you.
The process was very, very serendipitous in that in 2013, I was on a reporting trip to Yosemite National Park for a totally different story. I was there for a week. And while I was there, one of the people that I was on this reporting trip with was like, oh, there's this museum dedicated to the history of Hart Mountain Relocation Center, which was where Japanese Americans were held during World War II. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And they were like, oh, would you like to go check it out? And something about me personally is that I was born and raised in Hyde Park, New York, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's hometown. So I went to Franklin Delano Roosevelt High School. Our team mascot was the Presidents. My middle school was built with New Deal funds, and Roosevelt approved the project himself, the architectural plans. So my entire life has been very much wrapped up in Roosevelt lore since I've been, 2 years old or whatever. So I went to this museum thinking oh, I know this history. I have an understanding of this history because of my own personal history. And so I walk into the museum, and I walk out an hour or so later just totally embarrassed by how little I know about this history. But while I was in the museum, there was one display that talked about high school life in the camp. And I still to this day think it was the first time that I'd ever read all the way to the end of a museum display, to the last sentences. And the last sentences were about the Eagles football team and about how, they were undefeated until the very last game they ever played, a 1913 loss to Casper Natrona. And, I went home after the reporting trip was over, and I wrote the story about Yellowstone. Oh, yes, I said Yosemite earlier, Yellowstone. But I just couldn't get those sentences out of my mind, the sentences about this football team. And I just kept thinking, and this would go on for weeks and then months, and then a year or two would pass, but I could not get those just couple sentences out of my mind. And every reporter knows that if you're working on something but you can't stop thinking about something else, you need to actually work on the thing that you're actually focusing your mental energy on. So then I reached out to the museum and was like, hey, do you know anything about this? And they were like, not really, but this guy, Bacon Sakatani, who was in the documentary, he has copies of every single issue of the Hart Mountain Sentinel, which, because Hart Mountain, when it opened, as they said in the documentary, was the third largest city in Wyoming. It had at its max, almost 13,000 people that lived there. So it was a city, so they had a newspaper that was really, really well written. And important to my research is that they had a sports section. So Bacon sent me a CD with every issue of the Sentinel on it. And I basically went through and read every issue and then created this roster, essentially, of all of the sports, every player that had ever played, every game they'd ever played. And then I had no idea what this project even was at this point, or if it was going to be anything. And then the best player was this young man named Babe Nomura, who had died in the late 90s. And I found his daughter and sort of explained very broadly who I was. And this sort of project just took off from there. She agreed to meet with me, and then everything just snowballed. And then I spent years of my life working on it.
So it may go without needing explanation, since the NFL actually made a documentary on this topic. But there are so many books about Japanese American incarceration. If you're a scholar, you're definitely aware of all of them. Fewer of them are being sold at Barnes & Noble than you're going to find at a university bookstore or a conference, for example. But everything from legal entryways into understanding incarceration, religion, art, gardening, nature. There's so many different ways of looking at it. So what makes for you football an important lens to explore the history?
Well, I mean, I think think about the last 2 weeks living in Philadelphia, right? So sports are this really unifying factor for lots of parts of society in ways that many things aren't. And it's a unifying factor in a positive way. Like, we all unify about sometimes things that are going wrong. And there's obviously a huge backdrop of this is something catastrophic that happened to these people. But football, to me, was a way to tell the story of Japanese American incarceration through characters and through a lens that was both unexpected, but then, like I said before we showed this, I'm always interested in finding new audience to tell this story to. And since I was someone who I thought was pretty well versed in this history, was shocked by how little I knew about it, I knew that there were millions and millions of other Americans and other people around the world that knew even less about Japanese American incarceration than I did. So if I could find a way to convince people to read this interesting book about ostensibly football, but then actually write the book about this era in Japanese American history, this era in American history, and sort of tell this story about immigration and racism and prejudice, I sort of saw, and I mean, I'll be honest, as a white guy, people are kind of more likely to pick up my book, and it's a terrible thing to say, but it's truthful in that I've talked to lots of Japanese Americans that they said, if I had proposed this book, I wouldn't have sold it. And it's, so for me, it was like I had this platform that a lot of people whose families experienced this history would not have had to tell this story. So I knew, it was a very nerve-wracking experience to write the book too, because you are dealing with, I'm not Japanese American, so you're being allowed into a community that has suffered for generations because of this history. So for me, it was making sure that everything was right in the book, that I was writing it tonally accurately, tonally correct, and that I was telling the story in a thoughtful, respectful way. And, I hope that happened.
What kind of responses have you gotten from people who've
The Japanese American community has been exceptional. They have been laudatory. They've loved it. I get the people that dislike it often say that there's not enough football in it in the book. So maybe those are the people that I thought I had tricked into buying this book about football. And maybe if I wrote the book again, maybe I would trim some of the history back. But the lens and even the cover of the book was important to me to get people, and we've talked about this before, like thinking about a book as a Trojan horse and being like, if I can convince somebody to pick up a book about football and World War II, here's all these other histories that I can teach them about, again, immigration and farming and Japanese American and Asian American life on the West Coast from, the late 1800s until the 1940s. That to me was like, I have to take this opportunity because it's not going to come again. So I'm going to jam in all of the vegetables into the book too.
So the film starts with the quote, the famous quote from George Santayana about the need to know your history. And as we also know, and an historian, you can take the same documents, the same information, and come up with as many different interpretations of what is meant as there are people in this room. But we hold fast to that the need is the need to know our history so that we don't repeat it. So I think there's stuff that we could dig into from your book and from the video. And I think, first of all, as we saw in several montages, but particularly at the beginning of the documentary, of photographs and cartoons, including the one from Theodore Gazelle, who we better know as Dr. Seuss, about the fifth column, the stereotype of Japanese and Japanese Americans as the fifth column that is just waiting to help the Japanese forces out on the West Coast. So we see all of these very vitriolic images that did not all come after December 7th. Many of them preceded that, and as we, if you know the history, you kind of put the numbers together. December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. It was not until February 19th that President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. So there were 2 months there where nothing happened. That things did happen, but the movement then to definitely pull Japanese Americans from the West Coast took effect. So it was not a done deal. It was not obvious. There was not a huge groundswell right after December 7th, as we saw after September 11th, to say anybody who has any descent, any relationship to Japan, however many generations away that may be, let's send them away. That was a slow build. Tell us a little bit about what that was, how that movement was created to.
Yeah, it's interesting because right after December 7th, right after Pearl Harbor, there's an opposite reaction, is that there's a very concerted effort from politicians and newspapers to say, don't blame this on your Japanese American neighbors in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle. And then the tide starts to shift in the new year. And a lot of that was because, and this is again talking about literal and figurative vegetables, that farmers on the West Coast had been in previous decades really pushed out by Japanese American farmers. Japanese immigrants came to the United States and just introduced really superior farming techniques on the West Coast. And it basically pushed white farmers out in a way that Japanese were much more efficient at farming. They're much better farmers. And they basically took over the vegetable and flower markets from Seattle all the way down to San Diego in just a couple decades. So when Pearl Harbor happens, a lot of farmers see an opportunity to take back that power and to take back their land and to take back the money that they had lost essentially to Japanese and Japanese American farmers for years. So they start sort of convening and then getting the ear of really local politicians like city councilmen, town councilmen, and it sort of starts churning and growing to the point that the Los Angeles Times starts covering it, and then the Los Angeles Times, and this is all in a couple weeks, in 6 or 8 weeks. And then, everyone sort of remembers, oh yeah, we also just don't like them because we're racist. Like, it's not just economic. So there have been decades of racism and racist laws against Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, and Japanese Americans on the West Coast in terms of property rights, citizenship rights. Asian immigrants weren't allowed to naturalize and become US citizens until 1952. Mm-hmm. So, there's all of these laws have been pushed against them for years. And then you have all this sort of groundswell coming up from farmers and locals that eventually makes its way to the press, and big national columnists end up starting to push more and more for removal. And there's disinformation being shared on the front page of the Los Angeles Times saying that Japanese and Japanese Americans in Los Angeles are sending signals to submarines off the coast. They're setting up, arrows on their roof for bombing destinations. And none of these end up being factual in any way. You could read every report from the Navy, from the FBI, from US intelligence before the war and after the war, and that they found no real sense that Japanese Americans would be disloyal to the United States. But because this fervor had been whipped up, this eventually makes its way to people like Carl Benditson and John DeWitt, who eventually wrote and implemented the Executive Order 9066 that made its way to Roosevelt's desk. So it really starts on sort of a groundswell and then works its way up to the politicians and columnists and radio men of the day who really started spreading it far and wide.
So we also had misinformation campaigns, which I think touches on for me, on how the Eagles are portrayed in this documentary as a counterpoint. We had a lot of misinformation campaigns saying, oh, the people in the camps, they're living better than everybody else. They get 3 square meals a day. They're making more money than a soldier is making. All of these things are, well, we really should be just, give them wormy gruel and, why are we letting them have this life? So I can imagine that there were, negative reports in Wyoming and elsewhere maybe about the fact that, oh my gosh, these kids were able to play sports.
Yeah.
We have our sons over there, serving in Germany and yet, in Europe, and yet these kids get to play football. So how does that compare to this tone that you try to set in your book and in the documentary, recognizing the hope and the joy in the game and the possibility for these kids, most of whom had never played before, to actually play the sport and so successful,ly, and also this reminder that they were prisoners.
Right.
Yeah,
I think, when the War Relocation Authority originally sent all the Japanese Americans to the camps, they removed pretty much everything that they had that brought them any joy. They weren't allowed to bring Japanese language reading materials, Japanese language records. Religion was really restricted at the beginning and then eventually sort of blossomed. So the only thing they really had when they got to the camp was athletics, because they sort of viewed that, the people who were running the camps, they viewed that as, oh, this seems American enough that we can let them play baseball or play football or whatever it is. And it also, pretty quickly, the people who were guarding the camp and, broadly speaking, the federal government, realized that unless we gave the Japanese Americans some stuff to do, we were going to have a real problem in terms of violence in the camps, escapes, people trying to overthrow the camp. So a lot of it was a calculation on the part of the local Heart Mountain staff, but then also the federal government to say, in a way, to sort of appease these folks, we need to give them something. And eventually they were allowed to have, there's a Japanese language version of the Heart Mountain Sentinel newspaper. Eventually, a lot more of the, quote, Japanese-ness seeped back into the camps in a way that the government at first really tried to destroy before they were sent to the camps and once they got there. And for me, the idea of it being a football team was really interesting to me because, baseball in the United States and Japan kind of came up at the same time. So Japanese immigrants to the United States already understood baseball. And to them, baseball was not necessarily an American sport. It was a sport that they understood. It was a sport that they played. So baseball was like, oh, we know how to do this. We can play this really well. But football was this thing that no Japanese immigrant or their children had ever experienced unless they were in the United States. So for me, there was this really sort of meaningful and potent idea behind these young men who were deemed not American enough to keep living in Hollywood or Seattle or San Francisco or wherever they were living on the West Coast, to then say, not only are we American, we've been born here, we're children of America, but we're also going to beat you at the most American game. And that to me was always this sort of powerful symbol that these young men, when I interviewed some of them for the book, they don't view it that way. They're 15, 16 years old, and they just want to hit some guys on a field. But looking back, like we were talking about how we interpret history, and I think looking at it now when I'm writing the book in 2019, 2020, that lens and seeing like what this meant for the people in the camp to view these young men come together so successfully in something that in a way kind of proved their Americanness was a really powerful way. And it really helped me find a way into the story, which was also, you know, every single person in this room has been a teenager in their life. So finding a story that was universal in a way that you could tell through the lens of teenage life was also interesting to me because, again, everyone can think about the fact when they were a teenager and what your life would have been like if you were 16 and had to say goodbye to every friend you'd ever had, give your friend your roller skates because you were about to take a bus to a train to a state that you'd barely ever even heard of before. So
that's really interesting because your book does deal with subjects who were youth at the time, and much of the work that has been, besides novels, but much of the historical work, scholarly work about the camps are often focusing on adults who, for the most part, are no longer with us. When we think about the Holocaust, when we think about Japanese American incarceration, those generations are all dying off, and we're losing people who can speak from memory of what it was like. And so your experience, you were able to interview a few people who were still alive, but some of them you had to talk to family members. Tell us a little bit about the experience of those interviews and what you were able to take away from them.
yeah, I mean, this is a great example of, this book was kind of put the nail in the coffin of my procrastination because there were people that I wanted to talk to that died before I could get to them, before I could get to LA to talk to them, like literally like weeks before I was supposed to be there. So for me, it was really important, like I said at the top, I reached out to lots of different families, and I would not have written this, it would have been a bad book, first of all, but I would not have written this book without sort of the inherent permission of these families, because again, it's not my story to tell, really. The experience was really profound for me to speak with people that were in the camp, but then also to share with their children or their nieces and nephews or their friends who had this other view of what their life was like in the camp, and to sort of speak to them and to see heirlooms from that time period and to sort of go through photographs and really try to spend as much time with these people as I could. A lot of times as a journalist, you are writing this story this month, this story the next month, this story this week, 2 stories this week, or whatever that might be. And you unfortunately have to kind of come in and out of people's lives in a way that sometimes feels really wrong and sort of feels like you're just parachuting in. And with this book, I was really able to spend years with people and spend years building relationships with people before I ever even got a book contract. You know, like I started talking to families in late 2016, and I didn't get my book contract until the summer of 2018. So you're spending all this time with these people. They're being very generous with their time for a project that might not even happen. So it's like, for me, it's honestly been the greatest honor of my life to work with these families and to tell these stories, because like you said, a lot of people are dying or people's memories are shrinking, and typically there's not new documents that are coming out. So you have like a set amount of things that you can have. There's not new stuff. You just have stuff that's sort of drifting away when people are passing away or their families are, deciding not to talk. And luckily for me, there was no one that didn't want to talk to me for the book. And I think that was the woman I talked about at the top, Jan Morey, who was Babe Nomura's daughter, sort of served as my liaison. And she was like, no, Brad's legit, like I've spent time with him. And then she vouched for me in the whole, not just with people from Heart Mountain, but the whole Japanese American community across the country, and the book would not have been, she's the first person I talk about in the acknowledgments, because the entire book would not have been I wouldn't have been able to do it without her, so.
Well, I know there's lots of questions I want to keep asking you about, but I'll put them out there. You know, I want to make time for other people to ask questions, but encourage you also, read this book, go to the library and find other books. But I think you do a great job, for one, talking about the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, which really,
we're gonna get to that.
I wanted to get into that, but really created a lot of resistance to the effort by the government to finally, after having discharged everybody who was in the military on after December 7th, was now saying, we want you to serve, and
Not only want you to serve, but we're pulling you out of camp and expect you to
yes,
serve
and
for a country
yeah.
that has put you in prison for years.
Yes, and we want you to serve, and they really started this movement that spread to the other camps,
Yeah.
and create a lot of issues, which, you know, I encourage you, read the book if you don't know about it, or go to densho.org, DENSHO.org is a great site, an encyclopedia to help you get little quick, brief bites if you don't have time for a book right now. But,
yeah, and Densho's great. I wouldn't have been able to do this book without them. They have lots of oral histories, too, on their site that I was able to use, and everyone there is fantastic. So.
It's marvelous. But let's open up to questions. I'm going to ask you just to, you know, question, and then I will paraphrase it so that the camera will hear, people who will get it, that watch this later will be able to hear the question. And then Brad, Phil. We'll get you second. Phil first. So, yeah.
Right.
Roosevelt had this as his history, and the story here, as a white person, I only have passing knowledge. This really brings it home as an outsider. You came to this story by happenstance, and then you found yourself immersed in it. How difficult was that for you?
So the question is, you know, as we learn about the dark side to Roosevelt, for example, how Brad came to this research, how it affected him, kind of delving into the darkness of our psyches as a nation.
Yeah, I think the best way to illustrate my answer to that question is that I had to take multiple massacres out of the book. Like, I had to edit them out, because I got to the point where when I was writing and researching it, it just got so sad that I sort of lost some of the humanity in it, and I sort of lost what I was really trying to tell. And we can get so obsessed with the bad stuff that's happening, and there was a lot of bad stuff in this book, but I had to always sort of recenter myself and think, what is this in service of? What is this specific anecdote in service of? Why do we need to know another terrible thing that happened in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1928 or whatever, before this ever happened? And yeah, it was, you know, I still have the remove of being a journalist, right? I still have the ability to sort of say, I'm in my house in Philadelphia, I'm safe, I'm warm, I have a family that loves me. And I think it was also hard for my wife, because writing a book is a really lonely process. You're the only person that's sort of dealing with this information, and you don't have anyone to talk to about it. So I would go downstairs and be like, oh, here's this terrible thing that I just learned about, and my wife, who's a lawyer, would be like, all right, like another day of like bad news for Brad. Like, when I was done writing this book, my wife was like, maybe you should write a book about dogs. And yeah, so I found that I could not, when I was researching and writing the book, I couldn't read any other nonfiction, because I found that I was either comparing myself to those books, but then it was also, there's a lot of sad stuff in those books, where at least in fiction, I felt like I could kind of escape a little bit into fiction writing in different worlds, as opposed to just being in another reality, another chunk of history, so.
So Larry, and then. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But you also said that the Japanese are generally small.
Right.
And football is probably not a national sport, like baseball has become a national sport in Japan, almost to the point where when the major leagues expand, one of the top teams to go in will be from Tokyo.
Yeah.
So just noting that it's interesting the football teams in the camps when the Japanese young men tended to be fairly smaller in stature, but that they were great. The Japanese baseball teams have long been recognized as among the top.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was also, football was popular there, but still, like, baseball was, I told this story through the lens of this Heart Mountain football team because they represented something bigger, but baseball in the camp was still a massive sport. They had different teams, they had lots of different teams, so depending on where you got sent to Heart Mountain from, whether it was from Pomona or LA or San Francisco, all these different guys would form teams with their crew from back home. So they would create teams and different, basically like varsity clubs in camp, and they would play each other. And eventually the federal government actually allowed them to create an all-star team at Heart Mountain that played an all-star team from another camp in Gila River down in Arizona. And they would travel back and forth because, again, eventually the federal government realized, we all know that we sort of made a mistake, but Roosevelt won't let us close the camps. So we might as well do some things in the camps to allow the incarcerees to have some semblance of a real life again.
I think was there a question back here? I don't want to.
First of all, thank you for this story. I think it's an important story, especially for the time. And Brad, what I'm sort of wondering, a two-part question is, was it really difficult to build trust with these folks? Because, I know that from my own personal experience, talking to my relatives who served in World War II, whatever, they didn't want to tell me stories. And, the kids didn't even know the stories. So I'm wondering how difficult it was to build trust. And then also, what did these folks think about the fact that the American government betrayed them? I mean, were they still harboring that fear of government that we might actually be going to jail?
Sure.
So the two parts. One, how difficult was it for Brad to build trust with the subjects who he interviewed, particularly the survivors? And then how did they feel about the government, even this far past? Were they still harboring fear of the government or anger, or what were they feeling?
Yeah, it's interesting in that those are two separate questions, but I can almost answer them with just one answer. In that, after the camps closed in 1945, Japanese Americans, when they went back to the West Coast, didn't really have the opportunity to sort of boo-hoo and feel sorry for themselves afterwards. Because when they got sent to the camp, they essentially, most of them lost all their belongings. They lost their homes, they lost their cars, they lost their appliances, they lost their clothes. So when they came back to the West Coast, they just had to start over. So they didn't have time to really think about and be angry. I feel like there were definitely some people that were angry, but they knew that they had to go. They had kids. They had to figure out where these kids were going to go to school. They had to figure out where they were going to live. They had to get new jobs. They had to do all of this, to the point that I think a lot of them didn't talk about the camps. That generation in the Japanese American diaspora is called Nisei, and the Nisei generation really didn't talk that much about camps. Most of them didn't. Their kids didn't know that much about it. Their kids that were born, in the 50s, once they got back and got married and started having their own families. So there were times when I was doing interviews with families where people that were in the camp were saying things that even their kids didn't know, which was pretty, for me, baffling that they were going to tell me this. But it was also an interesting opportunity to see multi-generations of families sort of connect over this story in a way that maybe they hadn't before. And as far as trust with the government moving forward, I think that, the racism that sent all of these 120,000 Japanese Americans to camps didn't mysteriously disappear. So as soon as I got back to the West Coast, that same racism existed. So I think that from a government standpoint, these folks had so many things they had to deal with in their day-to-day lives for survival, in terms of physical survival, their children's survival, that, there's a reason that the redress effort doesn't really start until decades later in terms of getting reparations for the camps and getting an apology. And that's because that first generation, when they came back, had so many things to do to rebuild their lives. Basically, I remember finding a stat from, I think it was the Federal Reserve when I was writing the book, that the Japanese American community on the West Coast didn't recover financially from the camps until like the late 70s. So you have 3 decades basically of rebuilding.
That's in the back. We'll go around.
My grandparents, were in Phoenix, Arizona. My dad was born in an internment camp. There is a Japanese American philosophy sitting here in Japan of just moving ahead. I never learned about this from my grandparents. Learned more about it from living in Hawaii over there and how the internment camps came to be. I've been to, with my family, my kids, the internment camp in Topaz, Utah. It said, make recreation in Missouri. Nobody is having any fun in this barracks. I guess I don't have a question, maybe a little grander question of like, anybody in this room that voted for that fascist Roosevelt office who doesn't think that this can happen again, you're just fooling yourself. I don't know how we go about not having this kind of racist, xenophobic activity happen ever again.
He shared his father was born in the camps, his family was in the camps in Arizona, which were based on Native American reservations, and that he didn't learn about this history from them. He learned from Hawaii, which interestingly resisted the order to intern Japanese Americans there, because they said, well, we know they didn't cause any sabotage on Pearl Harbor. We know they weren't active in that. Our industries would entirely fall apart if we didn't have Japanese American residents here and citizens who were doing the work. And it's just ridiculous that we're gonna, send them on a boat over to California, so they're staying here. But yet you learn about the history in California, in Hawaii, and remind us, the Supreme Court, Congress never passed any laws, never made any rulings saying that this was illegal and unconstitutional. So, I think to your point, these things can happen again, and it's wise to know your history.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that part, the thing that it truly can happen again, which is such a scary, sad thing to say, that over the intervening 80 years, we haven't decided to prioritize that and sort of think about the least among us, and not necessarily even the least among us, but how this could happen to any of us, really. There's no safety structure set up for any of us in that. And the expression shikata ganai, which is, just sort of power ahead and just don't think about, and that's, that Japanese American generation, they put their heads down and they just came back and they started working again. And it's, I understand why they had to do it, but it's still hard to think about the fact that they had to come back and just sort of restart their lives and not really be able to process this awful thing that had happened to them for the past 3 or 4 years. So.
Her comment is, that it's many people still are not aware of this part of our history, and it's not taught in many schools. I grew up in California, and I don't remember learning about it in my schools either. So the importance of education over here.
Many people are not aware that there were many Italian internment camps and German internment camps as well. And I'm curious to know, in your research, if you would happen to come across anything about sports in those camps?
So questions about the German and Italian internment camps, which is different than incarceration camps.
No, I mean, they were in much, much smaller numbers, the German and Italian camps, compared to the Japanese American camps. And that was purposeful, like sort of the racism that led to the Japanese American camps. There was not the same fervor to incarcerate German or Italian Americans, and it was because German Americans and Italian Americans were walking among us all on the East Coast, and the West Coast felt like this sort of far enough away that Washington can just sort of say, let them deal with this, and we don't have to really think about it as much. I didn't do much research. There was so much research for this book that I wasn't even able to include in this book, so I didn't spend much time researching the German or Italian camps. And I think that, there's other good, there's a great book that just came out called The 15 that's about German POW camps in America. That's really interesting and sort of talks about American POW camps. So I'll let somebody else take that one on the next time.
I think I've been told we have to wind up. But yeah, it's interesting to know, though, that the internment camps were for people who were not citizens.
Yeah.
So it would have been German nationals and Italian nationals, and for the most part, they were, captured who were brought here.
And they were folks that were able to naturalize, whereas
yes.
Japanese immigrants weren't able to naturalize.
Yeah, it's important to remember, to point out that many of the first generation Japanese Americans who were here had been here for 40 or more years and had not been able to. But I think we're going to have, because I was told by Tricia back here that we're out of time, and you have your reading to do. But Brad will be here, and I think you can mob him.
You can.
And ask questions afterwards, but Brad will do a final.
Sure, I have a shorter one and a longer one. So I'll do the shorter one because you can read the longer one when you buy the book. So this is set during the Eagles season in 1943, and they're playing against a team that is called the Carbon County Coyotes. The 1,100-person student body filled the sidelines once again. If the Warland game is expected to be a blowout in favor of the visitors, the fans, coaches, and players had no idea what to expect from the team from Red Lodge. The county's location on the state line meant the Coyotes split their games, half Montana teams, half Wyoming teams. No one at Heart Mountain knew anything about the Smith mine disaster or the fact that most of the Coyotes were off in the South Pacific aboard a Navy ship. All they knew was that the team had lost to Cody the previous week, which didn't stop the Sentinel sports editor from confidently announcing, quote, with Babe Namora leading the attack from his tailback position, the Heart Mountain 11 is favored to take the Red Lodge Prepsters by a 3-touchdown margin. The teams lined up under a 78-degree sky, and the Carbon County kicker sent the ball deep. Keechie took the ball at the 10-yard line and ran diagonally across the field, heading to the left sideline. Babe faked as a blocker, then sprinted toward Keechie. The pitch was flawless. Babe cradled the ball, looked downfield, and saw nothing but open dirt. Arms pumping as the dust kicked up beneath him, he was gone. Gone from that field, gone from camp, gone from Wyoming. Remove the barracks and the barbed wire and the military police. Add some bleachers and sketch in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel looming over the field. Replace the stones with grass, color in the green of the palm trees and the white of the wobbly Hollywood sign watching from Mount Lee. Replace all the bad with all the good, and for those seconds, he can be just a boy doing what he loves most. Babe strode into the end zone untouched.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad, so much for coming this evening and sharing with us from your book. Thank you to all of you for showing up for a day of remembrance, for a part of our history that's important that we remember and that we find ways to learn from. And hopefully we didn't end on such a note that you all are just, oh man, depressed when you go home. But hopefully it'll give you some food for thought for how you are an active citizen in our world today.
The other reading was pretty depressing.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I
Thank you for
chose-
not doing
yeah,
that
yeah.
one. And your book, tell us where you can buy your book.
Anywhere. Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Head House Books, everybody. And if they don't have it, tell them to order it and get more on the shelves too.
And you can check it out from
And it's
the
here.
Athenaeum.
Yeah, it's here, the Athenaeum too. And there's also audio and, did I read it? Yes. It's good? Yeah, it's good. It's also back there available to be
Checked
taken
out.
here at the Athenaeum. And Daniel is great, and I've done some panels with him, the author of Facing the Mountain. All his books are great, yes. People often say about my book, this is not as good as The Boys in the Boat, which is Daniel's other book. So. Yep.
Yeah, tell
Thank
people
you.
how they can find
Yeah.
it so you can share it
So
with your
this,
friends
you can
and your
find it on,
grandchildren.
it's on YouTube, the short documentary. And then also, the book is used in lots of schools. And the thing that I'm most proud about with the book is that it's in more than 1,000 library systems around the country, which for me is like, it means it's gonna be there for a while, and hopefully people pick it up for a long time and learn something from it. And I told Beth that when we were talking about this event that I've never turned down a speaking opportunity to talk about this because I think the story, it's not my work. I think the story is so important for people to know. So thank you all again.
Thank you. And I'll ask Tricia when she sends a follow-up email, I'll send a follow-up email to you all, including the link to the video.
That were worked by. Oh, really? Okay.